And welcome to everybody out there on the internet. My name is Shawn.
And I'm Frank, and tonight we are going to St. Kitts.
St. Kitts. Once again, so this season, we've been traveling around the Caribbean, and we started actually in Florida, and what we're doing is we're talking about one of our favorite alcohols, which is rum, and how it's kind of shaped different areas of the Caribbean, and a little bit of history lesson on those different locations. We've been to, started in Florida, we've been to Cuba, we've been to Jamaica,
Nicaragua, Haiti, we've been to Barbados,
St. Lucia.
Yeah. And so this week we're in St. Kitts, and it's really fascinating to see how rum is different in each one of those places. It has its own unique taste to it. It has its own unique style. And so tonight the rum that we're featuring is called Brinley Gold. And it is out of St. Kitts.
Have you guys ever come across and see that there, Brinley Gold?
So they have a ton of different kinds. Their specialty is their spice rum, but they have a white rum as well. But then they've got a bunch of flavored rums too. They have a lime, they have a vanilla, which when you go on their website, they have specific recipes for those, which is kind of neat because most of the recipes that I've seen on the other ones are just for their like top ends.
Yeah.
So this one it's got a cool thing. It looks like a book.
Gotcha. And for tonight, our actual drink for tonight that Frank and I are partaking in is actually off of the website, and
it's called a Harborside, and it's an equal part rum, cranberry juice, and grapefruit juice.
And it tastes absolutely delicious. So that's our drink for tonight, our rum and the Isle of St. Kitts. What's so special about it?
Well, it is actually the smallest country in the Western Hemisphere. St. Kitts is all of 69 square miles.
69 square miles.
Yep.
Is it just one island?
No, it's St. Kitts, and then there's a tiny little island right next to it called Nevis.
Okay.
And so they're separated by about a 1.5 mile channel called the Narrows, and those two make up their own little thing. And their history is very much like the history of the other island nations we talked about. They had sugar plantations. They had a little bit of piracy here and there. They were controlled by either the French or the British or the Spanish at some point. So very much the same.
Yeah.
To me, St. Kitts, the one thing that I found really interesting when I was doing my research on them is they are one of the biggest manufacturers in the Caribbean of electrical lights.
Ah, okay.
So you wouldn't think that on an island they would be building that, but the low voltage lights and stuff like that, they're the place to go, and that's their biggest export.
Excellent. Very cool. And they make a darn good rum. Now, the rum tonight, obviously, we talked about is Brinley's Shipwreck, which ties into our lesson tonight. So when you were thinking about shipwrecks, what did you think about?
Well, I was thinking about there were so many that I could have. So what I started with is my favorite author, Clive Cussler. And he has an organization called NUMA, which is the National Underwater Marine Agency. And what they do is they go and search for different shipwrecks all over the Caribbean and along the coast of the United States and stuff like that. So I was perusing his website, looking at some of the shipwrecks there. And one of the things that I noticed is the biggest concentration of when ships sank in the Caribbean was during World War II. So and most of those were sunk by U-boats. So that's what our topic's going to be tonight, is looking at the U-boats during the very beginning of the war when they had such great success against the American, British, Dutch, all of these nations that were there.
Now, why were U-boats in the Caribbean? I mean, that's a long way away from the European front. That's a long way away from Germany and Italy.
So it was about two things: aluminum and oil.
Okay.
So Great Britain had most of its oil came out of the Far East or in the Middle East. Sure. But once the war started, they couldn't transport it through the Mediterranean because Italy was there blockading that. So the bulk of the petroleum that Great Britain was getting was actually coming out of Venezuela.
Okay.
So in the Caribbean, there are a couple islands that have these massive refineries. So they would purchase it from Venezuela, and the British had a big refinery on Trinidad that they would take it to. But the largest refinery is actually on the Dutch island of Curacao. And so they also had that. And then when the Germans invaded the Netherlands, Great Britain kind of took control of that refinery there and the refinery on Aruba, and so they could control the output of that. Because what I read was they had to have a minimum of 4 tankers a day come into port
In England.
To be able to keep the war effort going. If it went below that, that was going to really harm their war effort. And that's what the U-boats were trying to do, is they were trying to blockade and kind of suffocate them and prevent them from getting any kind of resources that they needed. So that's what they were attacking here. Now, the U-boats, though, they were at the far end of their range here in the Caribbean.
Gotcha.
So there was 2 major types of U-boats at the time. There was the Type 7 U-boat, which is the most famous one.
And these were talking about German U-boats.
German U-boats. Yeah. So if I say U-boats, I'm only talking about the Germans.
Gotcha.
And then there was the Type 9 U-boat, which were a longer range U-boat, and they could make it to the Caribbean. They actually went as far as working out in the Indian Ocean as well.
Gotcha. Now, when we're saying U-boat, U stands for
underwater, or in German, it's Untersee.
Gotcha. So submarines is what we're talking about.
Exactly. So the German U-boats came there, and they were specifically in 1942, right after Germany and Italy declared war on the United States in December of 1941. They already are sending U-boats in January, February for 2 major operations. The first one is called Operation Drumbeat, or the direct translation from German is Timpani Beat, so the big kettle drums. Yep. And this time period from January to August of 1942 became known as the Second Happy Time, or Zweiter Glückliche Zeit, which they called it that because...
The second happy time of the war.
Right. Because,
for Germany.
For Germany, because there was initially in 40, with the U-boat sinking tons of ships going in and out of England. And so this one was them sinking tons of ships off the United States and in the Caribbean. Sometimes it's also called American shooting season for them, right? And just to give you some numbers.
And they loved it because they sunk a bunch of our boats, but...
No, we didn't sink any of theirs during this period of time.
So it was a fish in a barrel.
Yeah. They sunk 609 ships in that 6-month period, totaling over 3.1 million tons of cargo and vessels. Wow. So they were just slaughtering it. Yeah. And the only thing that kept them from doing more damage was they had to reload. So they ran out of torpedoes and would have to go. And what was interesting is when I was looking at it, about half the ships in the second operation, Newland, were actually sunk by gunfire. So they would surface and they would shell them with the deck guns to sink the ship to save torpedoes for more important targets. So in the first operation, they sent 5 of these Type 9 boats to the Caribbean. And
those are the bigger long-range submarines.
But they had little to no charts or anything of the American coast or the Caribbean.
And this is before GPS and satellites and all of that.
So most of their information was actually coming from cruise ship captains from the Hamburg American line, telling them what the ports looked like and stuff like that, because they had taken the ships there.
Yeah.
And one of the U-boats, U-123, had been given 2 tourist books of New York City. One of them had a fold-out map of the harbor, and that's what they were supposed to use.
That was their map to get around.
For getting around New York. So it's kind of funny when you think about that, that they're really kind of going blind. Yeah. Just basic information of where stuff is, but where they needed to go and sink stuff. So in this first round, which was just through the beginning of January, they sunk, those 5 U-boats sunk a total of 23 ships, right? In about a 2-week period.
Just in the Caribbean.
Yeah, just in the Caribbean, right? And so and most of these were tankers, or there were some freighters as well. The initial goal was definitely the tankers, right? And then we have the second operation, which was the one they were even more successful at, because they doubled the number of ships. They had 6 U-boats go, but they also had 5 Italian submarines go. And they targeted certain things. So 3 of the U-boats targeted the refinery at Curacao. And then one of them targeted the refinery at Trinidad. and then the other subs went all over in different places to spread out the Allied anti-submarine forces so that they could operate even better.
Gotcha.
And sink
Just causing
ships.
chaos as they went.
Yeah, exactly. So for us as the Americans, we wanted to help protect those, but we had to protect our own coast along the
because
New Orleans.
We were producing oil and stuff as well.
Yeah.
And we had talked about in previous broadcasts that we had actually had submarines off of New Orleans, off of Texas, even off of the Gulf Coast here.
Right.
In fact, I was talking with someone who had lived here during the 1940s, and they used to have beach chairs, and they would actually volunteer and sit out on the beach and watch the water off of Anna Marie Island, looking for submarines.
Yeah. So as we look at the Americans, they are slow to get going, and that is why the Germans are so successful, because by mid 1942 and then really into 1943, the tide sways, and the Americans are going to start to sink German submarines in huge numbers.
We realize the problem, we figure out how to do it.
Yeah, and our biggest asset that we're going to have is airplanes. And as part of what was called the Lend-Lease Act with Great Britain, we took and leased their bases from them in the Caribbean. So we sent our troops there to station there.
And sent them home back to England and Europe to bring the fight back there.
And what we did at those bases is then we put reconnaissance squadrons that had these big flying boats, the PBY Catalinas,
Drum and Gooses.
Yeah, yep. And so they would fly and do their reconnaissance, and these boats would be able to fly high enough where they could see the shadow of the submarine under the water. And then what they could do is, because the submarines would hide underwater during the day and then be on the surface at night, well, they could then drop depth charges from the planes and sink the submarine.
Which is a depth charging explosive that hits the water, sinks, and then explodes underwater where the ship is at.
Yeah, it's set to be explode at a certain depth. So once it feels that pressure, it explodes. And that was one of the big things that really helped the Americans, was to have these reconnaissance planes. And by 43, we're really starting to manufacture tons and tons of airplanes.
Gotcha. And depth charges.
That, and we're having the crews to fly them, because we've trained the pilots to do that. So as we look at the Germans and the Italian U-boats in this, they sink together about 40 ships in that week and a half, 2 week period that they're there. And that's pretty significant when you think about it. And even with all of the bases that we're beginning to take over, because we had it in British Guiana, which is on the northern coast of South America. We took over St. Lucia from them, Antigua, Trinidad, Jamaica. And so we were able to start putting planes everywhere, especially along the main routes. And then we started using the convoy system down there as well, where you'd put all the ships together and you would then have them screened by anti-submarine ships like destroyers and destroyer escorts.
So we figured out the system and basically how to beat the submarines fairly quickly, but not without some significant losses.
No, there was significant losses at the very beginning. But then once we started sinking their ships, it was interesting because about half of the crews on the submarines that we sunk actually survived. And most of them were taken to POW camps here in the United States. And
not only here in the United States, but also we talked about before here in Florida.
Yeah, there was two big bases, one in Orlando and one in Jacksonville. But the one in Orlando had satellite bases, including one here in Venice at the Venice Air Station.
Yeah.
And so realistically, some of the sailors from these submarines were probably in Venice doing manual labor and stuff as part of their time as a prisoner of war.
And obviously when we were fighting the submarines and taking them down, not all of the soldiers or sailors survived. I mean, one of the funniest stories is in New Orleans, and up there was a submarine that they had sunk, and it was a couple days later that German bodies started washing on shore. And the funny thing was that in all of the sailors' pockets were all pamphlets for New Orleans brothels. So apparently they had gone ashore and had a great time in New Orleans
Right.
before, and then made their way back to the boat.
Right.
So great stuff.
So most of them were sunk, as I said, by airplanes, but there were a few of the submarines that were sunk, and there was one that I found really fascinating. The U-94 was actually sunk because it was rammed by a Canadian ship called the Oakville. So they were able to, an airplane made it come to the surface, and then they rammed it, and then it sunk from there.
Yeah.
But most of the men on that one, but only 2 died on that submarine. All the rest of them they captured.
Well, I think it's amazing that we have so many ties. You know, like I said, everything from the naval base or the base down in Venice to where we have some POWs, and even off the coast here and off Anna Maria. But we even have some other ties as well with some of our American submarines off of our coast. We actually have a memorial.
We have the only national underwater cemetery in the country here in Sarasota.
Yeah.
So, and it represents all of they have reef balls that represent each of the submarines that has been lost, most of them during World War II, but lost in service to the United States.
I think it's called On Eternal Patrol.
Yep. So you can come, and if you have had a member of your family that was in there, they will go and
actually dive down and look and see. Yep.
Yeah, and put their remains there with it and all of that, which is really kind of a fascinating thing. And we've talked about that before in some of our earlier podcasts. So that's kind of what we've got for today.
I say it's amazing. Like I said, it's so interesting to me that the ties. You think about World War II, you think about Europe, you think about that, but really the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast of Florida was a huge part of that. So,
right.
Excellent, and ties into obviously shipwrecks and our shipwreck rum tonight. So thank you guys so much for joining us here tonight. What are we doing next week?
Next week we are going to the Bahamas.
Ah, okay.
All right, and so we're going to talk about some of the rum that comes out of there, and we're going to talk about a little bit of Bahamian history.
Excellent. So thank you guys so much for joining us here tonight at the Bahia Hut, world famous. And also to join us again next week, Monday nights at 7. And for those of you who are here, we're going to obviously do trivia afterwards. And hopefully everybody will do good. We have some great rum to give away as prizes from Shipwreck. And we'll have a great day. We'll see you guys next week.
All right. Enjoy.